So we're starting here at the 1-3, and the 1-3 is the first and primary profile. If it wasn't for the 1-3s, we'd have no place to start. So we might as well have them around, eh? There's something actually very beautiful about it because it really sets the story. So let's talk about, first of all, what a first line is. The nature of the first line is that because it's the beginning of the process, it is the foundation. In other words, the first line of introspection is about finding out what the basis of the hexagram actually is. And if you need to understand what a hexagram means, all you have to do is look at its first line. Because its first line is going to give you its foundation, it's going to give you its basis. At the same time, the first line is the chameleon. That first lines have this ability to disappear. They have this ability to disappear so that they can go inward and be introspective and not be bothered. And that chameleon capacity within the first line is the kind of being that, they can be in a crowd, in a room, and they're really in their own space, deep in their own process. And nobody notices them because of that. So that first line has that capacity of being able to hide itself. But most important of all, it is about investigation. It's trying to figure out what things are. Now look, this is the very beginning of a genetic process. So what that means is that that first line is trying to establish the foundation of whatever it is, whatever the hexagram is, whatever the life is, and it's trying to say, okay, this is it. However, it has a third line underneath. Now the third line is very different. The third line's the anarchist. The third line says, wait a minute. So what happens with the 1-3 profile, and it's one of the most common things, is that they're the ones that make our evolutionary process possible because they try to figure out what the foundation is, realize that there's something missing, or realize that there's something faulty, and then their unconscious takes over. They become anarchistic. They tear down that foundation to try to build a new one. In other words, they keep our evolutionary process going. But there is nothing more self-absorbed than a 1-3. After all, they are really into their thing. The first thing is they need to find out what the foundation is, so they spend a great deal of time in their life trying to get to the bottom of things. And of course, they get to a point where it's just not enough for them. It's never going to be enough for them. It's not solid enough. There's something wrong with that foundation. They're always going to have this need underneath to deal with it, to do something about it. In this graph, we have the personality profile, and the first thing that we're looking at is the behavioral identity. Now, this is rooted in the 10th gate. The 10th gate treading is the gate of literally being able to live in the world, the potential to love oneself, to love life, to be in the world. It is the gate of behavior. So here we begin with the behavioral identity. Then identity is the investigator, what we've just been describing. In other words, that's what their personality behavior looks like. On the surface, their personality is absorbed. They look absorbed. They look like they're involved in what they're doing. Underneath that is their nature. In other words, underneath that behavioral identity is their nature, the nature that's there in their blood. And the nature that's there in their blood is the martyr. So you have this combination of the investigating martyr. And of course, they're ready to be a martyr the moment their investigation shows them there's anything wrong with the foundation. And then they're ready to martyr themselves and say, there's something wrong here. This foundation is not holy. Right? These can be very, very tough beings, wonderful at being able to figure out things. After all, they're real investigators. They like to get to the bottom of things. The next level is we come to the projected attitude. Now, that projected attitude is rooted in the 7th gate. And the 7th gate is the role of the self in interaction. It's part of the channel of leadership, the design of an alpha. The 7th gate is where we have all of our potential roles for leadership. So the projected attitude of the first line personality is, I'm the boss, I'm the authority. You can understand their dilemma. See, they have to be an authority. which means that the foundation has to be solid. If the foundation isn't solid, then they don't feel like an authority. The instantaneous result can be inferiority complex, all kinds of fears of inadequacy, all kinds of discomfort, because, of course, they expect the foundation to stand up. They expect that this is the way things are really supposed to be, only to discover that they're not. They need to be the authority. At the unconscious level, what their type is that they are an anarchist. Their personality on the surface is saying, all right, this is the foundation, I know this is exactly what's true, but the moment they have that feeling inside of them, the moment they recognize that it's really not true, that it really doesn't stand up, boom, out comes the anarchist. And the anarchist comes out and says, I'm going to tear all that down. People really misunderstand anarchy. They really do. Anarchy serves a very important purpose in this life. What the anarchist does is that the anarchist is able to recognize what does not work. That's all. They don't know what can replace it. After all, this is the beginning of a 12-profile process. They don't know what can replace it, but the anarchist can recognize what doesn't work and destroy it. So it's possible for something new to emerge. So out of this very powerful authoritarian personality that's out there up front, underneath it's ready to be the anarchist that tears down the very thing that could have given it authority. In other words, they're a very powerful force. And when they get to the point where they see something doesn't work, they are not going to pay lip service to it. I mean, these are, they can be incredibly honorable beings. After all, they've got their personal destiny. And for them, that personal destiny means I've got to find a foundation that's solid in order for me to be at peace. The next stage in this is the personality profile, the limited perspective. Now, this is coming from the 13th gate, the fellowship of man. This is a gate of direction. It is part of the channel of the prodigal. It is a place of listening. It is a place of memory. Now, that limited perspective is empathy. Now, it's limited. It's important to realize that's always a condition of that place in the personality. This is a limited perspective. They are empathic to a point. To a point. That's their personality. They're empathic to that point because they would like to know if somebody knows something about the foundation that they don't, they will have empathy in that. They will be open to that to a certain point. But that's all. When you get to the unconscious level and you get to the memory, the reason for that is that they're driven by pessimism. There's nothing more pessimistic than the third line. And of course, what happens to them is that the moment that there's anything wrong with the foundation, that pessimism gets to be a very, very heavy thing. They look at everything from that point on with a jaundiced eye. They look at it and they say, well, yeah, I don't know. You see, the moment that a 1-3 finds out that daddy isn't the strongest and mama isn't the sweetest, oh boy, out comes that anarchist. They are immediately disappointed. It means that that foundation that they thought was something that was going to be reliable, that foundation starts falling apart. And then, of course, the anarchist comes out. And I mean, the moment the anarchist comes out, you've got the zealot, That anarchist will really try to sweep things clean, and they can become very, very pessimistic about the way in which the world operates. The aspired to role. This is the first gate, and the first gate is the need for expression. It's part of the channel of the creative role model. It's about the individual's need to express its uniqueness and its unique direction. So the aspired to role of the first line is creativity. In other words, again, not seeing things in just their black and white, but the moment that you find that the foundation doesn't work, there's some really creative and artful things that can happen. People try to fix the foundation. Before they get to the point that the pessimism overwhelms them and they tear it down, they try to fix it first. They try to find, maybe it was my mistake, maybe I didn't see that. And yet out of that, it can be very, very creative. In other words, this is, because it's introspective, because there is this ability not to be stuck just in the foundation, that this can be a very creative force. At the unconscious level, you have direction, and the direction is sustainment. Nothing more impressive than third line people. If you have a third line in your profile, it can always be deeply impressive. It's impressive because, I don't know if you remember the old Al Cap cartoons, but he had these little funny creatures called kick-me's. And every time you'd kick them, they'd get right back up. And that's the whole thing about the third line. It's designed for trial and error, and they really look incredibly courageous. I mean, they look like, they can handle anything, which in fact, in many ways is true, except they're very pessimistic while they're doing it, but they drag themselves back up, and they get back up on the road, and they say, I know this isn't going to work, but I want to try it anyway. So when you're dealing with the third line and you're dealing with this direction, you can see that this sustainment is a very powerful force for them. They do not give up. And of course, they can be very radical. I mean, they won't give up in trying to fulfill the anarchy if it's necessary either. They really will stay with it. And remember that these are not beings that are going to be deeply influenced by others. They're not. I mean, they're going to be influenced in the ordinary way that we understand it through design, through conditioning. But in terms of where they're going in this life, this is a very powerful personal destiny. They have to get there. And when everybody's saying to them, look, it didn't work, you don't have to do that, they're getting back up and they're trucking after it again. And everybody's sort of shaking their head saying, well, that's really admirable. They can really stay with it. That's what they do. Those first four categories, this is all about the self. It's all about roles coming out of the self. When you get down to the last two categories, the bonding strategy and the security strategy, these are coming out of the sacral center, and these are genetic roles, and they are very powerful. They are much more powerful in many ways than the roles that are operating out of the self. After all, the genetic roles are all about reproduction and nurturing. It's about keeping our species alive, and these are very primary forces within us. The bonding strategy of the first line personality. I call the first line of the 59 the caveman, cavewoman line. You see it, you go out there, you whack it over the head, and you drag it home. This is first line sexuality. Exciting, isn't it? It's the basis. Remember what I said about finding out the basis of what a hexagram is. If you want to find out what the basis of our sexual strategy is, you go to the first line, you see that's what it was, caveman, cavewoman. We still have that. And the way in which it's described here, pursuer, pursued. And this is what it's all about. That is, this is the dynamic that's necessary as a bonding strategy for the first line. Either they have to be the ones that are pursuing, or they have to be pursued. Or they have to feel like they're being pursued so they can pursue, or whatever the case may be. But what you're really looking at is this very basic foundation. There it is. I want it. I'm going to go get it. Of course, only to discover the third line underneath that gets divorced more often, that quits more often. You get into the foundation that you think is going to be marriage as a first line. Remember, personal destiny. And then that third line comes out underneath and it says, bonds made and broken. This is the great third line theme. It repeats itself eternally. Bonds made and broken. So this is when the anarchy comes out. You've got a lot of 1-3s that are going to have a real bad marriage record. Because they're going to get in there and think that that's really the foundation, only to discover that it's not what it thought it was. And of course, the moment that the pessimism arises in the third line, that's the moment that the anarchist comes out. That's the moment that they're ready to tear down the relationship in order to try to find a new one or make a new one or whatever the case may be. It's very important to see that the nature of the third line, because it's about trial and error as a process in life, is to see that this is also a discovery process. And it isn't necessarily about burning bridges. Everyone assumes when you see bonds made and broken that there's a period at the end of that. Is there a period there? No. There isn't. It can be bonds made and broken, made and broken, made and broken, made and broken, made and broken. In other words, you can have a relationship with someone in which you're always making and breaking the bond with them. You go to work or whatever the case may be. There are many ways in which that can operate. It doesn't have to be always the dramatic, I've tried it, it's terrible, I'm leaving. Because, of course, that's, yes, that is a level of it, there's no question. In dealing with the third line, in dealing with trial and error, particularly when you're dealing with young people, if you've got a third line theme, you're going to have all kinds of disruptions in your early sexuality. In other words, there's going to be a lot of disappointment the moment that you begin to really meet the other. Remember, the third lines are not good at that, and the 1-3 profile is self-absorbed. The only way that somebody comes into their life is somebody bangs into them. Oh, I didn't know you were standing there, they say to them. They just bang into them. And suddenly, they get into a relationship, and again, because of their nature, they're going to check it out. They're going to be very introspective. They're going to go deep into what that relationship is. They're going to look at all of those things. And if they find anything in that foundation that doesn't work, whatever their concept was about being married or bonded to somebody, that third line theme is always waiting to break that bond. It's always waiting, to try something else. What's important is that all third lines, without them, we've got no real evolution. They're great. They're the ones that mix a potion and thinking that they're going to produce bubble gum, and they ended up producing medicine. Whatever the case may be. In other words, out of that trial and error can come all kinds of wonderful discoveries. And it's so important for third line people because they often are walking around with a huge cross on their back because they're carrying this martyrdom with them. And after all, there is nothing more uncomfortable than really feeling martyred in that sense. Particularly if what you're being martyred for isn't worthy of you. It's just something that you're carrying around. Third line people always carry that as a potential. So when you're looking at a 1-3 profile, you have to see how important it is that the children, because again, so difficult for adults to align themselves to what their real purpose is because they've got to go through this whole process of finding out their nature and becoming themselves to their design. Now, children can really have a head start on that. I have 2 sons that are 1-3s. That they're going to be into their own trip. Now, the most important thing about that is that the foundations that they're introduced to, at least the foundations that I can introduce them to, are solid. So that if they're introduced to what is solid, then they're going to be a lot healthier in the way in which they grow up because they're not going to develop this very, very early pessimism. But the other thing is that as a parent, I can also see that, I have a very social son. He loves to be with people. Yet at the same time, he's a 1-3. And he loves to be with people because they're there and he wants to have something to do. Now, it's not mercenary and it's not, It's not something deep inside he's using or whatever. It's just his nature, to take advantage of whatever is there for his own purposes. If you don't understand that, you try to condition them away from that. You try to, tell them that that's not nice and blah, 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 and all of these things. Of course, you begin to destroy them. That 1-3 has a very self-absorbed path that they have to go through in life, and they need to be introduced early in life to things that are solid. And also for them to be encouraged to see things when they don't work and not just to accept the foundation. Because then you end up with all kinds of suppressed anger. It's important for them to be able to say to you, I thought, and you didn't. And you say, yeah, that's true. So that they don't end up being really disappointed about the nature of the other. Remember that a 1-3 doesn't know there's anybody out there for them. If you're a 1-3 teenager, there's a part of you, no matter how many people are around you in your life, you don't think that anybody is really there for you because you don't know. And that everything about being third line in nature means that you're always going to meet people through them banging into you. I mean, it's the only way that they can come legitimately into your life. They have to bump into you. You can't go looking for them. It isn't going to work. It doesn't matter where your third line is. It doesn't matter if you're a 3-5 or you're a 6-3 or a 1-3. It doesn't matter. The people that are really going to be important for you in your life, they're going to bump into you. They're going to come out of nowhere because that's how it works. And this is the beauty for the 1-3 to understand they don't have to go looking, which is very helpful for them because they can be involved in, doing their foundation work and getting deep into their process. On the other side of the 59th gate, where we have our genetic strategies for reproduction and intimacy, on the other side of that, we have our security strategy. This is the 27th gate. Now, security strategy is very important because it tells you a great deal about the fulfillment of purpose in the process. Now, the security strategy of the 1-3 is to be the self-provider, coveter. And, of course, whenever you see a binary like that, you're not one or the other. It's a movement in life. You're always moving between those. You can self-provide at some point for this, and yet you can still covet the other. But it's part of your process. And the deepest theme in that is to be able to provide for oneself. You got a 1-3 child, make sure from a very early age that you pay them for certain things. Now, whatever it happens to be. Whatever minor job, duty. Because in being able to do that, you give them a healthy sense of their ability to be able to provide for themselves, and it's very important. It's a very, very difficult thing for the first line when it has to be dependent on others. It's very difficult. And it's so important for first lines to have the opportunity to be able to provide for themselves so that they don't have to be dependent on others to do their homework, to do their research, to be left alone. So self-providing is a dominant theme. And of course, this comes with the foundation. In other words, these are children that they need to be properly educated. And more than that, they need to be properly educated into something that can give them a foundation in life. In other words, that can give them something that will provide them with the potential for being a healthy self-provider. This is a deep dilemma for women in the 20th century who have the 1-3. It's a real dilemma. Because, of course, they must go out and have a career. It is very important for them. And, of course, that can bring in all kinds of conflicts with the other. Because they have their personal destiny. Because they're there to really fulfill their own purpose in this life. That they have to be allowed that opportunity to be their own self-provider. Without that being a big conflict for them. Because otherwise they're not going to be able to have a healthy relationship with their mate. At the unconscious level, this is about humanity. And the humanity is about bonds made and broken. If you don't allow a 1-3 to be a self-provider, they're going to break their bond with you. That's all. Quick. Because they need that. And if you come to them and tell them that, you're going to look after them, they're not going to be very happy with all of that. Even though you think it's wonderful that you want to look after them and care for them and nurture them. They're not going to find that nice at all, swarmy or something. What they're really interested in is having somebody who appreciates their need to be solid in their own foundation, to be a self-provider, to be able to look after themselves, to be an authority in this life. They really are here to be in charge. Now, if you look at the 7-1, you'll see that authority in its detriment can really be a sulking child, or demanding or whatever. But the reality is that it's essential for them to have this sense of authority in their life. So there's something in this life they really have to know well. Now, again, that is something that we can nurture in the young 1-3. We can introduce them to things that are solid. We can introduce them to things and show them how the foundation of them works so that they see that it's solid. Very important for them. And also to appreciate that if you have a child that's a 1-3, you have to recognize that they're also going to be, moving from one thing to the other. It's not like they're going to be staying with one thing very long. They have to go through their third line process. They have to go through their trial and error. And the things that are going to stimulate them in this life are going to come to them from the outside. After all, they don't know it's there, so it's going to bump into them. So they will try to get into something, see that it doesn't work, get out of it. Now, the longer we stay on the planet, the easier it gets, and we all know that. And one of the things that we have to learn to accept and honor is everything that's been a part of our life. I mean, everything. Everything. There are no mistakes. These are all geometries. And every single one of those aspects that we go through, whether they're good or bad or indifferent, they're all part of the material that gives us the opportunity to be clear later in our process. And that is particularly true of third lines and sixth lines, as you'll see, but in a different way. But for the third line, it's absolutely a basic dynamic in their life, that they have to learn to see that the potential for pessimism in them can be deeply, deeply disturbing. It can really eat them up. And out of that, they can miss so many possibilities in their life to see what could be there for them. It's important for them to see that trial and error, that breaking bonds is a natural part of their process, that it is not unhealthy, and that if you're living out your design and you're entering into things correctly according to your type, there isn't any trial and error that isn't valid. They're all valid. And no reason then to be overwhelmed by the pessimism. The 1-3 profile begins our process. It's the start of our evolutionary dynamic. It is the beginning of that hexagram. It's the beginning of that cross theme. Yet at the same time, there is a movement. Now, in describing the movement as I will, going all the way through till we get to the top, though there is an obvious progression through all of that, I don't want anybody to get into a trip of thinking that if you're at the top of the profile, you're in a better place than somebody that's at the bottom. Because it's a natural human tendency, you know. I'm more developed than you are. I'm an old soul, you know. I mean, yeah. No, it's not about that. All of them are connected to each other. Every single one of those aspects demands its relationship with the other, demands its relationship with the whole. So it's not about saying, okay, he's a 1-3, he's way down there, you know. I'm a 5-1, man. I'm way up there. Don't get into that. I always love that when people say to me, geez, that's a tough design. And I think, what did they see? You know? I mean, what did they see exactly that makes it tough? I mean, they're all the same. I mean, they're just designs. You know, there's no good ones, there's no bad ones. So don't get caught up in thinking, oh my God, I'm a 1-3. You know, I'm going to have to die and come back at least another 40 times before I get up there to the top. Eh? It's okay. Each one stands on its own. What you'll notice is that there is a dramatic movement, as you'll see. That is, here you can see that the personality will repeat itself, and underneath, the designs will move. So you always have this shifting that's going on all the time. So everything is interconnected to everything else. So the moment that you have the sun in a first line, then you can only have either a third line unconscious or a fourth line unconscious. In other words, there's no other possibility. So if you look at your sun and it's in the first line, you're either going to have a 1-3 as your profile or you're going to have a 1-4. Now look. So here you can see the full cross, the 41-1, 26-1, that's the Sun-Earth. And then the design Sun in the third line and the design Earth in the third line. So here's a 1-3 profile. When you get to the last 11% of that line, it's 7 minutes and 30 seconds. The last 7 minutes and 30 seconds of the line. A line is 56 minutes and 15 seconds wide. A single line of arc. So in the last 7 minutes and 30 seconds of that line, that's where you have this transition. And what happens is, because of the 88 degrees, it stays a first line personality, but the unconscious shifts from the third to the fourth line. So what that means is that if you look at that hexagram as a whole, 1-4s represent 86% of it. In other words, there's going to be many, many, many more, 1-3s than there are going to be 1-4s, because it's a smaller section of that line. So what you're going to find is, whenever you look at a profile that's a harmony, the 1-4, the 4-1, the 2-5, the 5-2, the 3-6, the 6-3, whenever you're looking at harmony crosses, these are the changing crosses. They are the ones that are part of this last 7 minutes, and there's always less of them in the population. Always. So, for example, we had what? We had 4 1-3s. Are there any 1-4s? See what I mean?